Ivana Bacik.
Ramaka Count Corla. And I'm glad to have the opportunity to speak for the Labour Party in today's important and historic debate. I welcome the Taoiseach's apology today, which marks an important step in Ireland's recognition of our shameful history as a society, our history of the appalling treatment of women and children over so many decades. It recognises that far too many of our people were incarcerated in reformatory and industrial schools, in Magdalen laundries and mother and baby homes and other institutions, in what is a very recent and shameful history, and we acknowledge that today. Abuse was systemic, it was known about, it was covered up and brushed under the carpet. And it has taken brave and courageous survivors over many years to shine a light into that dark and shameful history. And I want to acknowledge the mighty M's who are here today. Mary Donovan, Miriam Moriarty-Owens, Mary Dunleavy-Green, Maurice Patton O'Connell. I want to welcome you, I want to welcome your families, your supporters. I know there are many here in the gallery and many watching online. I want to welcome Carmel MacDonald-Byrne and so many more. And I want to thank and to acknowledge the late Christine Buckley. Carmel reminds me that it's 30 years this Sunday since Dear Daughter was aired, that groundbreaking documentary made by the late Louis Lenton, in which Christine described her horrific abuse in Golden Bridge. And again, Carmel reminds me, and I had the privilege, I should say, of knowing Christine, who died so sadly in 2014, but Carmel reminds me, Christine said about her appalling experiences of abuse, she said, "We need a year's counselling for every day we spent in those hellholes, those hellholes." And I had the privilege of representing survivors of abuse before the Residential Institution Redress Board in a previous life as a barrister, and I heard firsthand from people about the utterly horrifying experiences they endured, the appalling abuse, the vindictive, systemic, sadistic abuse that they experienced in those institutions. Count Corla. It stays with, I think, any of us who've spoken with survivors, it stays with us all. And I want to thank you all for shining a light into what had gone on for far too long, and as I said, what was known about, what was covered up, what was systemic in so many institutions. It has taken great bravery, it's taken courage of survivors to shine a light, and the campaign has taken far too long. The trauma we know inflicted upon you at such a young age will last a lifetime. And you shouldn't have had to protest so long in this latest stage of seeking justice. Meetings with survivors who were protesting outside Leinster House last autumn should not have been postponed or delayed, because we know delays magnify hurt. I'm glad the protest did culminate in the commitment from government for today's state apology, but the apology must have meaning, it must have impact. And I do welcome, Taoiseach, and Tánaiste, the package of measures you've announced to include financial assistance, prioritised access to social housing, trauma-informed healthcare and education supports. These are welcome. But survivors tell me that they're now keen to get a timeline of when those services will be put in place. They and their families are understandably anxious to know when the commitments will be upheld, when will the services be made available. Clearly, the first important part of continuing to right historical wrongs is the apology today. But we must, all of us, collectively ensure that proper justice, full justice and redress is delivered to provide dignity and closure to a group of people who have suffered for so long. Thousands of children subjected to systemic and sustained abuse at industrial and reform schools going back to the 40s. Physical, sexual, emotional abuse in schools operated largely by religious orders, but funded and supervised by state entities. Neither the Church nor the state intervened to prevent mistreatment. The Catholic Church in particular is known as having acted as a sort of shadow welfare state, operating institutions on behalf of the state abdicating responsibility to vulnerable children. And I'm glad to hear the Minister for Justice is going to make very clear about the absolute lack of criminal record, because far too many of the adults I represented had been sent in through criminal courts, appallingly, criminalised by the state, sent in to suffer criminal abuse at the hands of religious orders in institutions. It's utterly shameful that there are still people living today who had those experiences. So it's long past time that that piece, that justice piece, is dealt with. The Ryan report in 2009, which Taoiseach, you rightly described, that was a watershed moment. And I still remember people coming up in the street, talking to public reps, talking to so many, about the experiences they'd had as children that they had suppressed, but which was brought again into their minds by what the Ryan report revealed. And that was a really important step again in uncovering state complicity as well as religious orders complicity. There was much that was wrong with that redress scheme that I described, the Residential Institution Board, and I think we've learnt from that, and we now know how much we need to ensure enhanced supports and substantive supports are made available to survivors. And I welcome that there will be progress made on the pension point in particular. But Taoiseach, I think there are two forward-facing calls, two forward-facing further points that need to be made. The first relates to our duty as legislators. We need to identify and address gaps in child protection legislation to ensure that our legislation is now robust, is now fit for purpose, and that the state is no longer able to outsource or neglect the care of our most vulnerable in our society. And I'm thinking of those who are still in congregated settings, those children, for example, who come here as unaccompanied minors who are in state care, children in state care in many different settings where again we owe a duty and we must ensure we don't fail again. But the second call is to ensure that the religious orders are made accountable. And I've spoken before about how the churches, but in particular the Catholic Church, enabled a culture of secrecy and cover-up to develop for far too long. How for far too long also church authorities were very slow to pay due redress, that the state paid a huge share of redress despite having been promised that religious orders would engage in delivering justice. The Labour Party has introduced a bill that seeks to address that imbalance, as you know, Taoiseach. Our bill seeks to facilitate civil proceedings against unincorporated bodies such as religious orders. It provides a mechanism for recovering damages from the associated lay-run trusts set up by so many religious orders to hold their assets, so that those assets can no longer be pursued for unpaid redress. Successive governments have repeatedly failed to compel religious orders to pay their fair share of redress, and many continue to evade responsibility. Our Labour bill is now in the lottery for debate in private members' time. It's about ending that evasion and ensuring that religious orders face accountability, and that religious institutions that enabled or ignored abuse for far too long, or enabled the perpetration of abuse for far too long, must be held accountable for the harm that they caused. If we pass this legislation, the Oireachtas has an opportunity to take a meaningful further step towards justice, dignity and truth for survivors, because we cannot simply appeal to the moral duty of religious orders to ensure that victims receive the justice they deserve. We've seen slow pace of action, avoidance of responsibility and legal obfuscations for far too long. To conclude, Taoiseach, I want to state on the record that we owe an enormous debt of appreciation and gratitude to all those brave survivors and victims who've shown such tremendous courage in coming forward to make disclosures, to reveal to us all the true extent of abuse in religious-run and state-run institutions for far too long. I hope that all those survivors and victims and their families watching and listening today will find some solace in today's proceedings. I do welcome the apology, and I do believe we still need to do more to ensure true justice for survivors.
Thank you, Deputy.